of dialogue, despite the rainy and windy weather we've had these last couple of days. Allow me to introduce myself. My name is Joanna Lastor Montes, and I'm the graduate assistant for civic literacy and on-campus events for the Center for Civic Engagement. At the Center for Civic Engagement, our mission includes the objective of fostering students' awareness of local, national, and global issues, and encouraging students to be active citizens and contributors to their national and local and global communities. Much like today's event titled Student-Faculty Conversation, War on Terrorism, and the United States defeat in Afghanistan, doesn't matter, we encourage you to continue the global conversation outside of these doors on how we can understand these events and how it relates back to our lives. Joining us in today's discussion, we have Dr. Carolyn Eisenberg, a Hofstra professor of U.S. History and American Foreign Policy, who has worked with several congressional offices on foreign policy issues and is presently the legislative coordinator for Historians for Peace and Democracy. We are also very fortunate to have Dr. Paul Fritz, if you want to wave a hello, an associate professor of political science who has co-edited a volume of the foreign policy of the George W. Bush administration and specializes in international politics, security studies, international organization, and U.S. foreign and defense policy. Without further ado, it is my pleasure to pass the mic to Dr. Eisenberg to start today's discussion.
Paul's going to start first.
Okay.
And we're going to all go up there.
Okay, awesome.
Everybody gets a mic.
Okay, awesome. And really capture what Day of Dialogue is really about.
Thank you.
Yes, absolutely.
We can encourage people to come to the front.
Yeah.
They ignore us.
So thank you, Joanna, for the introduction.
Some people can take their masks.
Oh, I guess we can. Can you hear me with my mask on? Okay, well, I'll keep it. I'm used to it at this point. We've been teaching like this forever. The name of the panel is about discussion. So we're hoping that maybe some students will come up. We're hoping for a smaller, more intimate setting to be able to do discussion. So if you could come up, that would be great. We would appreciate it. Before we get into anything, to get to discussion among students rather than just faculty, we have three amazing students with us that are going to be part of this panel. And could you each introduce yourself to the audience?
Okay. Hello, I'm Damali Ramirez. I'm a senior journalism and political science major. I am a CCE fellow, and I'm currently taking Dr. Fritz terrorism class.
Hi, I'm Nicole Kerr. I am a second-year student with a major in political science. I took Professor Fritz's Terrorism and World Politics class last semester, so apparently that gives me authority to talk about this. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Amanda Vrishio. I am a senior and a history and political science double major. I'm currently in Professor Fritz's Terrorism and World Politics class this semester, and I've taken too many classes to count with Professor Eisenberg.
So do a good job. So I guess everybody will know this isn't a terrible mistake by you. All these.
Rusty, did you want to say anything before we start?
No, I think Paul's going to start us off. And I think our plan is that Paul and I are going to make some general remarks initially. And then, really, we have questions that we want to ask the panel and then of students, and we hope other students that are sitting here are going to join the conversation as well. So, Paul, you want to start?
All right, good. So I'm going to try to keep it like at 10 minutes or so. There's a lot to cover in 10 minutes, but think about this topic, the war in Afghanistan, the larger war on terror. War in Afghanistan was the first response to 9/11 by the United States. This is the very first action in the so-called war on terror. It lasted 20 years at a really high cost. The numbers from Brown University's Watson Center that's kept track of all of this or 2,448 American service personnel killed. Over 3,000 private contractors, security contractors killed in Afghanistan war. Over 1,000 allied soldiers, mostly from NATO countries. And about 250,000 Afghans, civilians, Taliban fighters, security forces, and others. So the human cost was extraordinarily high. And that doesn't include the countless numbers of soldiers and civilians with life-shattering and life-altering injuries. So the human cost is high. The financial cost has been high. Trillions of dollars have been spent on the war on terror in general, much of that in Afghanistan. So after so much money, after so much blood, how and why did the US lose in Afghanistan? Does it matter that the US lost in Afghanistan? What does the defeat in Afghanistan mean for the larger war on terror? These are some questions that I hope to be able to shed a little light into and hope to spur some discussion with. I think to understand some of the questions or understand sort of where we are today, we have to go back to the beginning and how the US framed the larger war on terror as a response to 9/11. There was really an expansive notion of what a war on terror was going to be. The Bush administration sought to defeat terror, not al-Qaeda, the group that perpetrated the attack, not the Taliban, the group in Afghanistan that supported al-Qaeda and gave them safe haven, not terrorism or terrorists in general, but terror. Right? This is a very wide framing of this. The administration envisioned really a global effort that was highly ambitious, critics would say foolhardy, to essentially remake the world in a lot of ways. If we think about the national security strategy that came out in 2002, but was guiding the action in Afghanistan before this, these ideas were all there in the administration. It included expanding American power in the international system, especially military might, using that military might then to preventively stop terror around the world, to promote democracy as a way to root out terror, as this was seen as sort of non-democratic authoritarian states were seen as the root of terrorism. And while there are many other things, one other critical thing to think about was sort of the unilateral nature of this all. The US was at its zenith of power, or so it thought, and it could do this essentially alone. And if not alone, then at least on its terms. And that's the sort of the way we think about unilateralism. Probably the best way to think about that is when George W. Bush said, you're either with the terrorist or you're with us, and getting across this notion. This whole strategy that led to what we have seen over the past 20 years is pretty audacious in terms of a national security strategy. And Afghanistan was the first venue for all of this. This was sort of, I don't want to call it a test run, but it was in ways sort of testing out the ideas, if you will. The initial invasion of Afghanistan very shortly after 9/11. And there's a whole bunch of details I could go through here, but I'm not going to bore you with that. But the initial invasion was really a highlight of American military prowess, or supposed to be. A very light force, yet very high-tech force, invaded Afghanistan with the help of many Afghan allies on the ground, drove the Taliban from power very quickly, and providing sort of a collapse for the structure that allowed al-Qaeda to operate within Afghanistan. From some angles, this worked pretty well initially, or at least some people could make that case. The defeat of the Taliban was quick. The costs for the US were pretty low in terms of a war, and the US did this solely on its own terms. In fact, just to demonstrate that, NATO offered to help with the invasion of Afghanistan. That NATO, the alliance that's provided security for the US for the past 75 years. The same NATO that invoked Article 5 after the 9/11 attacks, and Article 5 famously says an attack on one NATO member is an attack on all NATO members. So NATO was ready and willing to help with the war in Afghanistan, but the US said thanks, but no thanks. Right? We want to do this on our own, for reasons I'll talk about later. So, but this initial part did seem to go pretty well, right? And given those conditions. That said, a lot of the al-Qaeda leadership the group that was responsible for the attack, slipped across the border to Pakistan. Remained there. Bin Laden remained in Pakistan for a decade after this, until he was finally found and killed in 2011. Many of the Taliban slipped across the border or just faded back into Afghan society, essentially biding their time and waiting for an opportunity to come back. These issues would haunt the US for years, of course, and we would see this over time. But because, notwithstanding those factors, because it looked like it went well or at least pretty well initially, the Afghan war confirmed the Bush administration's approach to the war on terror, at least for them, right? That this would be a model to go forward, featuring a sort of a unilateral approach, rooting out all types of terror around the world, replacing it with friendly democracies, or at least this is the hope, all in a highly militarized approach. And the Afghan war, the initial results of it, sort of pushed this model forward. It was kind of proof of concept, if you will, that this could work, that this audacious grand strategy could work. And here's where I think we get into some critical factors of how and why the US lost, right? The situation, the losing dynamics of this war didn't occur just in the past couple of years. They certainly didn't occur, and the chaos that we saw in Kabul in the past a few months ago with the final evacuation of American forces wasn't the cause of the loss. Even the ill-advised deal that the Trump administration made with the Taliban that dictated the US was supposed to get out of the country at a certain time, that wasn't the cause for the loss. These were important issues. These are things that we've all seen over the past couple months, and these are things, probably the reason that partly the reason we're talking about this now. But the key issues that contributed to US leaving Afghanistan in a defeat relate to this larger approach in the war on terror, I would argue. There are two things that I want to highlight in this regard. One is sort of how the Afghanistan state was born at the Bonn Conference in December 2001. The Bonn Conference was an international conference getting together to decide basically how the new government in Afghanistan was going to be structured. And it was an international conference. It wasn't just the US that led this. And there were certainly Afghan participants. But it was very much sort of a Western-led organization. So I'll talk about that in a second. The second thing I'll talk about the war in Iraq. In March 2003, it started March in 2003, it stripped any chance of the US devoting the necessary resources to try to make anything out of Afghanistan. So those two factors, I think, really play a big role. Those early factors, really early in the Afghanistan war, play a big role in where we are today with the US having lost. So let me talk about those just a little bit, not in too much detail. The Bonn Conference, where a new democratic or democratic-ish government in Afghanistan was set up. This was necessary. The Taliban had been deposed. Afghanistan needed a new government. There had to be some structure there. The issue is that the US and other Western nations really pushed for a centralized government in the form most similar to a Western state. This centering all of the authority in Kabul, the capital of Afghanistan. And the idea was that Kabul could dominate. Kabul would be able to control the rest of the vast Afghan territories. This probably demonstrated how little the US understood about Afghanistan, trying to set up a really centralized government. Many Afghan experts at the time in the US were arguing this, and they were fundamentally ignored. They were completely shut out of the discussion. Many suggested that this was an arrogant move by the US in planning a governing system into Afghanistan in this way, especially, that really didn't have much chance of gaining legitimacy. And indeed, it never did gain legitimacy. The entirety of the Afghan war, from December 2001 until we left in August, the Afghan government never fully controlled Afghan territory. It held little bearing on people's lives in Afghanistan because it simply didn't have the power outside of the capital to do anything. The Taliban and others filled that void. And that was true for a very long period of time in this. What much of the Afghanistan war was about was simply propping up this regime in Kabul and never really publicly talking about how weak it was. The Bonn conference is probably well-intentioned, right? But it also probably shows the hubris of American policy that relates back to this grand strategy of transforming the world after 9/11 to make it safe for us and for others. Thinking that a stable democratic state could be a force of stability when it was born out of decades of conflict and being directed by outside forces was, according to many, the height of American hubris. So the Afghan state sort of started out in a hole, and it was really difficult and eventually proving impossible for this regime to survive without massive support from the US and others from the outside. This was all made worse by the invasion of Iraq. Now, separate wars, right? But we have to think of this as a part of a larger whole in the war on terror. The war in Iraq, which is a war of choice, and not everybody would see the war in Afghanistan that way as a war of choice. They see it as a response to 9/11. But the war in Iraq certainly is a war of choice. Effectively stripped US sources of the resources that were required to have any hope of stabilizing Afghanistan. Everything that had been on the ground in Afghanistan was diverted to Iraq for the purposes of deposing Saddam Hussein, who had been deemed this unholy and highly dangerous mix of despotism, terror, and WMD by the Bush administration that had to be taken down. Right? So this was a continuation of that larger war and terror dynamic, this larger grand strategy that the world had to be made safe from terror, including despots like Saddam Hussein. But it had these pernicious effects on Afghanistan. It could go on and on and on and on about the invasion of Iraq and what a strategic and humanitarian disaster that was, but I want to recenter it back on Afghanistan and think about the overall impact on the war on terror. But a quick comparison between the two might shed a little light on this too, of why we are where we are with Afghanistan. The war in Afghanistan was largely, although not entirely, seen as legitimate by the international community. There wasn't that much opposition to this. The war in Iraq certainly was not. It was opposed very strongly by most of the international community. The war in Iraq, in addition to sort of stripping resources, drained the US of a lot of legitimacy and a lot of goodwill that it had garnered because we were attacked on 9/11. Afghanistan became sort of, with the war in Iraq raging and getting worse and worse by the day, and we're thinking about 2003, 4, 5, 6, 7, Afghanistan became the forgotten war, where we just muddled through year after year after year. Muddled through with fewer resources than were necessary to stabilize. Muddled through just trying to make small gains here or there, only to see them evaporate overnight almost instantly. And set up sort of this path dependence structure, in a sense, where we were in Afghanistan to almost be in Afghanistan. Because we couldn't leave, right? All the while, what we see and what we're learning more about now is that there's a slow realization you can't win in Afghanistan with the way it is. We try different things in 2009 through 2013. We surge troops. We do all of this other stuff. The gains are made to some small extent. They're lost quickly. None of this, by the way, is really debated publicly or talked about publicly by the military or the various administrations that deal with this. So we end up in this situation where we've lost, right? And the final realization of it comes, I argue, in the Trump administration, and then the Biden administration finalizes the idea. But I think we lost a long time ago. It's these dynamics from early in the war that really determined the trajectory of what we've seen in Afghanistan. A question for us, and I think the sort of, what I gave as kind of backgrounds, the question I think for today that's more important for us in our discussion is, does this all really matter? In some ways, it may not matter to you in your everyday lives, unless you've served in the military or have family who have served or have other way been touched directly, it may not have much of an impact upon you. And there's a lot of evidence to show the American public essentially ignored the Afghan war for 20 years. And we only noticed recently because things got really bad in Kabul. If that's true, then getting out of Afghanistan, even in defeat, may not be all that consequential of an event. But I would suggest, to people like me who study foreign and defense policy, it matters a lot for a lot of reasons, and I could talk all day about those. But what I will say is I think it should, should matter to all citizens for all kinds of reasons. And I'll highlight just a couple, sort of, what we ask service members to sacrifice in the name of U.S. national security was tremendous. And we see, just the numbers I gave you before, almost the same number of people died fighting in Afghanistan, U.S. service personnel died fighting in Afghanistan as that terrible day on 9/11. It was a large sacrifice. It was a huge sacrifice. This was done in our name. There are other policies that were done in our name as American citizens in Afghanistan and the larger war on terror. The human tragedy of the war, the number of civilians killed, in the name of stopping terror, the abuses that took place that led many people around the world to question U.S. values and ideals and many other issues. Even if this was born of hubris and an audacious yet flawed strategy, we can't escape that this was in fact all done in the name of our security. Whether we agreed with it or not, it was done in our name, right? So I think we bear responsibility for this to some extent. Maybe less so students who were just maybe not even born on 9/11, but as American citizens, it was all done in our name. At a minimum, it's our responsibility to think critically about the experiences in Afghanistan, the larger U.S. war on terror, so that we can avoid the tragedies and mistakes and other things that we have seen with future policy decisions. So I went just a little bit over. I'm sorry, Rusty.
It's all right.
So
I'll
you-
probably be worse. Okay. And we are probably not going to disagree very much with each other, so this isn't a debate. And since we
Right.
each teach about foreign policy, I think one thing that's also true is that for both of us, these are very big events to think about and to react to. And I guess one of the things that's kind of weighed on me all along is the incredible discrepancy between the effect of our presence in Afghanistan. How many millions of lives have been turned upside down, some for better, but many for worse, right? It's a huge thing there, and it isn't here. All right? I mean, we knew, for example, when we set up this panel in Common Hour, that we know this is not a high priority, for most folks here, and there's lots of good reasons for that. But the discrepancy of impact is very, very startling. As some of you know, I actually going to read a little bit, which just to be time efficient. But if I'm going too fast, you could raise your hand and look annoyed, and I'll respond to that. So as some of you know, Congress is presently deliberating on a bill that would provide many urgently needed items. This is the Build Back Better bill, which we actually talked about in the last panel. And that includes things like Medicare, what they're arguing about right now, Medicare extension for seniors who might need hearing aids, dental care, glasses. These things aren't covered if you're a senior, you're living on Social Security, you also can't pay for it. Health insurance for poor people in states that are not covered by Medicaid, pre-kindergarten for 3- and 4-year-old children. I mean, these are things that are in that bill. 3 months paid leave for new parents or people who have to deal with a catastrophic illness in their family. Funding for new jobs and technology to deal with climate change, and the list goes on. And the wrangling over this bill has been going on for months. Every Republican has said they'll vote no because it costs too much money, they say. And because of that unanimity, the Democrats need every single vote to pass. And until now, there are 2 Democratic senators who have been saying no, which has made it impossible to move this bill forward. So that's what's going on now. Too much money. But meanwhile, majorities in the House and the Senate are on track to pass a $771 billion defense budget this year. So you might be sitting here and saying, what about Afghanistan? Aren't we supposed to be talking about that? So I'm going to come back to this point at the end of my remarks. Last month, so turning to Afghanistan directly, last month a long-standing truth became painfully, unavoidably evident, which Paul has said. in his remarks, the U.S. lost the war in Afghanistan. Knowledgeable people have known this for years, that the Taliban has been growing, taking over increased territory in the rural areas, in much of the country outside of the cities. And the success of the Taliban, the fact that we've lost the war, this is not really the fault of Donald Trump. I mean, sometimes we like to attribute everything horrible to Donald Trump. It isn't his fault, and it isn't Joe Biden's fault either. The Afghan government and its police and its security forces, backed by the United States, have been corrupt, often brutal, incompetent, and widely disdained because of their subservience to a foreign power. And that really all predates the arrival of Donald Trump. It's not amazing that this defeat had happened. After all, this is why the country of Afghanistan is known as the graveyard of empire. They earned that honor, and one way or another, they've driven out the British, they've driven out the Russians, and now us. As Paul's pointing out, this 20-year American project has been a costly mistake. And our government spent more than $2 trillion on this war. Approximately 6,500 U.S. troops and contractors have died, so it's like twice the number of people that died as a result of the World Trade Center bombing. At least 47,000 Afghan civilians have died in this, and the mission is unaccomplished. I would guess that everybody here has seen pictures or films of the situation at the Kabul airport with people desperate to get out. And more recently, the terrible news about women and girls being barred from schools, not being allowed to go to work. And there's no denying that these are horrific developments. And there's no denying that in Kabul and other cities, the American presence made life better for thousands of people. And there's no denying that the triumph of the Taliban is deeply troubling. But if we're honest with ourselves, I think we should also acknowledge that for years, the American public was paying, again, Paul made this point too, the American public was paying zero attention to Afghanistan. Not even when Afghan civilians were killed by US drone strikes, hitting weddings, for example, drone strikes that went awry. Not even when the Afghan countryside for years was drowned in violence, not all of it by any means just the result of the Taliban. This was something that most of us paid no attention to, didn't really matter. And while the situation in the airport was terrible, it was no more horrible than the mostly invisible scenes that were destabilizing the provinces. And no more horrible than the fact that literally millions of Afghan children right now are facing starvation as the US government holds on to Afghan government assets here in our banks and sets other limits on foreign assistance. I mean, the humanitarian catastrophe that is right in front of us in many ways dwarfs the horror of the airport. It's true, the end of this war was a mess. But that's not Joe Biden, it's not Donald Trump, it's because this was a 20-year war that the United States never had a chance to win. I want to quickly pivot to a deeper question, which is why did the United States choose to attack Afghanistan in the first place, to overthrow its government and try to reshape the successor government? Now, here's a story that probably most of you have heard. So here's the story. In the wake of 9/11, the American people were angry and wanted revenge, it is said. They wanted their government to wage war on the perpetrators, angry Americans needing justice. And there's some truth in this, but there's less truth in it than you would imagine. I was actually in Lower Manhattan when the attack occurred, and my Brooklyn home, like those of my neighbors, had dust from the World Trade Center all over the place. And then I was also back here on Hofstra campus for some follow-up events. And the mood early on, here and elsewhere, was much less angry than frightened, less aggressive than generous. In those weeks, a thing that people said was, or realized, is that every single life was precious. And I can remember when they rescue workers at the site could rescue one person from all that rubble. It was a tremendous thing. It was an occasion for cheering and celebration. In New York City, people everywhere were looking for ways to help each other. In my neighborhood, the Arab American Family Support Center reached out to a local synagogue, and together they staged a vigil on the Brooklyn Promenade, which hundreds of people went flocking to this event, carrying their candles and praying for peace. I would argue that the call for vengeance and war stemmed from the Bush administration and other politicians. And of course, there were feelings you could easily sort of fan the flames of other feelings, and I think the administration did that. From Washington, the received wisdom was that to deal with 9/11, the United States had to show strength and power, that it was absolutely essential to invade Afghanistan and overthrow its government. Had to do it. Because how else were we going to get Osama and al-Qaeda, our leaders said? How are we going to get them if we don't invade Afghanistan and get rid of the Taliban? And certainly there was reason to fault the Taliban for sheltering the terrorists there. But was war ever going to solve the problem? It took 10 years to get Osama bin Laden, who was found living in Pakistan. And precisely because, and I think we probably overlap on this, precisely because the Bush administration took weeks to get ready for the invasion, the leaders of al-Qaeda had time to flee the country, as did some of the key Taliban leaders. Was this really such a wise and brilliant response to terrorism? And after all, what did we accomplish by remaining in that country for 20 years? I think the answer is clear: nothing. So why did the Bush administration, and this is going to sort of end in this way, so why did the Bush administration, who were also supported by almost all Democrats, this wasn't just a Republican initiative, why did they decide that war was the only answer? I mean, why did they ever reach that conclusion? They could have seen it as a crime. They could have made this an international crime where we'd go after the perpetrators and bring them to some kind of international legal procedure. That wasn't even considered. There's no single answer to this question about why did the Bush administration and why did our political leaders go in this direction. But I want to start in thinking about this, I want to start with where I began my remarks. The ludicrous Pentagon budget that we have, the over-militarized nature of our government, the skewed sense of priorities. So, I mean, it's unbelievable that we're quibbling in Congress about could you give old people dental care? Can the United States of America afford to help people get eyeglasses, right? Because apparently we don't have money. And we can't create preschool for 3-year-olds, all things that other advanced countries do without question. And all these benefits we can't afford. But meanwhile, we're going to spend $771 billion on useless planes, missiles, submarines, and thousands of nuclear warheads, which could blow up the Earth several times over, but not to see a dentist for people. There's a familiar saying that probably everybody has heard, which is that when you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And my point about this whole phenomenon is that when you have a government so invested in the apparatus of war making, and corporations making huge sums of money producing instruments of warfare, and you have tens of thousands of Americans with their employment tied up in military industries, you have a disposition to go to war or to use military means to solve problems. So that's how we're going to go about it. Why did we stay for 20 years? Because the militarized nature of our politics and politicians created the imperative to stay the course. 20 years in a failed enterprise. To summarize, I'm now going to speak for myself as we sort of transition here. So in case you hadn't noticed, I'm older and also a product of the Vietnam War and the formative experiences of the 1960s. So I'm coming at it, and also somebody that was alive when 9/11 happened, and I know lots of you weren't, or you were like 1 year old or something like that. So I'm thinking about this problem with that, distinctive lens. And when I think about 9/11 and the resulting war on terror, I see a great tragedy. And that an experience that might have led our nation to rethink violence as a solution to problems yielded the opposite. 20 years of unnecessary warfare, sacrifice of millions of people here in the United States, in Afghanistan, Iraq, and many other places where our military is still operating right now. So to me, it's a tragedy. But the question is, what about the future? I think that a reversal of existing patterns depends on a younger generation, not old people like me, but younger people, who'll be attentive to politics, impatient with warfare, committed to using our national resources for the general welfare of our public, and prioritizing peaceful solutions to international problems. I think the future is with all of you and what will happen. And Afghanistan is open, but over, perhaps, for America, maybe. But if we don't deal with the militarized nature of our society and government, I think it is 100% predictable that we are going to get into more military clashes of one kind or another with the needless suffering of millions of people. So I am hopeful that in the future that we're going to move towards change. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Eisenberg. And I want to pick up on that to transition, because the students in the room, you're the future policy leaders. You're the ones who are going to be running for office, voting for the rest of your lives, doing things to try to influence your members of Congress. But we're starting in different places with this particular conversation, as Dr. Eisenberg pointed out, right? I lived through 9/11. Rusty lived through 9/11. We remember it viscerally. We know professionally, our duty is to study Afghanistan and what happened there too. But it's not just our voices that matter on this because of that, right? We want to hear what students are thinking about this, how you understand these problems. It may be vastly different than the way we understand these problems. Given perspective, given time, given just different political persuasions and other things. That's precisely why we brought Damali, Nicole, and Amanda up with us to start the conversation with the hope that that would draw you all in then too. So we gave them some questions beforehand, and I'm going to read them out and so that you all are on the same page, so that you can all sort of think about this. And we want to hear what you have to say, whatever you've thought about. So I think I should do all of them at once?
Yes, sure.
Okay, so these are the questions we wanted our panelists to think about and you all to think about. As has already been noted, some of you weren't born on 9/11, or some of you were too young to possibly remember it. How did you learn about 9/11? What were the impressions that stuck with you, right? Because that matters to us and the way we think about the response to 9/11. How have you learned about this? What did you see that was important? What's important about the events to know of that day? What were the types of explanations that you got, whether in classes or from family members or others? Shifting to thinking about the war on terror, which has been going on for 20 years since 9/11. What do you think it was? All right, is this a common, is this just part of common lexicon now, in a sense that it's just part of what you know since you've lived? There's always been a war on terror since you've been around, for the most part. What is the U.S. fighting for? What's the purpose? Do you know people who have fought in the military that have been part of this? Do you think this militarized approach is good? This war on terror was a good approach to dealing with things like 9/11. What about specifically Afghanistan? What impressions do you have prior to this summer about this? What do you think about the withdrawal of Afghanistan? Did you talk about this with your friends? Did it have an impact upon you? Finally, picking up on something Dr. Eisenberg said, what looks like a really big reality over there might be smaller and invisible to us when it comes to Afghanistan. is the obliviousness of the American public to things going on in our name outside of our country, in places like Afghanistan, a problem, and how, if it is, can it be remedied? So I want to turn to our panelists and then engage everyone else as well.
Right.
And I want you to share your thoughts on this. Don't feel like you have to be an expert. There's no expectations of that. That's what we've told our panelists too, just to reflect upon these questions. So, Damali, do you want to start?
Okay. Do you want me to answer the first question about how I learned about 9/11?
Sure.
Okay, so my parents actually shielded me from what 9/11 was for as long as they could, just because they didn't want me to be exposed at such a young age. By the way, I was 1 when 9/11 happened. They didn't want me to be exposed to that violence, and also they thought I was too young to understand the whole idea of why we were attacked. So I actually learned about it in school in 2nd grade, September 11th, and my teacher was just giving a very vague to the best of their ability of what a 2nd grader can understand about 9/11. And unfortunately, so I grew up in the city, and it was a very diverse neighborhood, and my classroom was very diverse. We had some Muslim students. So when they taught us about 9/11, one kid got up, pointed at one of my Muslims, friend, and literally called her a terrorist. And I was just, 8 years old, didn't know what that word meant. Other kids in my classroom did, because their parents taught them about 9/11. And it just became an awful situation for everyone. My teachers had to isolate the kid away from them. And I think that was my first impression of 9/11, was that it was an Islamophobic attack. And I went home that day, I went to my older siblings, and I was like, what is a terrorist? And unfortunately, they had to explain to me, what a terrorist was, and how this country has, after 9/11, grew to hate Muslims, and that when someone wears a hijab, unfortunately, they were labeled as terrorists. And so it was a kind of a cultural shock, but also a cultural shock, but also just confusion on why my friend was outed that day.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, for me, I was a 2002 baby, so I was not yet born, and I was about born a year after. And my earliest memories, I remember it in elementary school, but I remember it just being, hey, this is a thing. I don't remember any explanation behind it. I just remember moments of silence and that it was a very solemn day. I remember learning a little bit more about the history of it when I started middle school, high school, as that is more of an appropriate age to be talking about this subject. And once again, and I'm not sure if this was just because I don't have many memories of my history classes and such, I just remember it kind of just being kind of bits and pieces here, oh, yeah, there was planes flown into these 2 towers, the terrorists were all Islamic, and stuff like that. And it was just kind of putting pieces together without really a solid explanation, I feel. I don't know what that says about my public education, but it wasn't really until truly Professor Fritz's class last semester where it was a solid explanation and breakdown of everything that happened and why it happened, and really explained more behind it than just the very easy blanket explanation of they didn't like our country.
So I, am a 2000 baby and was a year old when the attack happened, so obviously no memories of it. But on the other hand, I actually discussed it as much as you can at that age, before school with my family, because I did have family members who were, in the city that day, and family members who were in the military after 9/11 and in the Middle East because of it. So I think I kind of really had an understanding of what it was, but not obviously anything to the extent that we learn about now, but that it was an attack on America's values is how it was always explained to me. And then similar, in school, I really only remember it being discussed directly on or around the anniversary, and it was about moments of silence, and we didn't even really talk about what was going on overseas. We just talked about and would remember like those who lost their lives that day in the US. And I think that really skewed your opinion of it until you do get to learn more about the background. But even though I did have more exposure to it before school and learning about it in depth, I don't think it can even compare to the knowledge that we have on it now.
Well, thank you. It's fascinating to me because Dr. Eisenberg and I yammered on and on and on about Afghanistan, and as a sort of this first point of 9/11 and the first reaction to it. But Damali, you saw the internal effects and the rise of anti-Muslim hatred, right? Nicole, you're talking about sort of how it was memorialized, right, with no detail as a sort of first memories. And Amanda, the family connection, the family and the ways involved in sort of the attack on values and the way that it was portrayed that way. So it's, I mean, the generational differences here are fascinating in terms of sort of, or I find it absolutely fascinating.
I'm actually wondering if the war part of this wasn't so big, and that's, just listening to, in other words, that there was the attack and how horrible that might have been or was, but it sounds like the fact that there was an ongoing war, right? All the time you were growing up, the U.S. was at war. But it sounds like that wasn't very relevant. Am I right?
Except for maybe Amanda's first.
Amanda?
Yeah, so I think that not just because I had family in the military, I think the war on terror was just always something that it wasn't a strange thing to hear about. It was just a very common phrase. And, I even from a young age, like I knew my cousin in particular, who I'm referencing, was overseas because of the events that happened on 9/11, but we wouldn't really talk about what he was doing over there or the consequences of those living over there. We would kind of talk about it in a sense of, well, we don't get to see him very often, and we have to really cherish the times that he is home, but it really how it affected us and not how it affects everyone in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in the Middle East in general.
It's interesting. Paul, were you here when at 9/11, or you hadn't been hired yet?
I was still in graduate school.
Right. So I guess I'm really like the old lady here. So, right. So it was really interesting. It's so different. I actually was on leave that fall, so I was at NYU, so I was, very close to where the attack happened. But I did come back to campus, and one thing was, I sort of remember being in this room and having conversations about what had just happened. This place was packed, and it was incredibly emotional for people, partly because a lot of people, Hofstra students knew people in the towers. I actually had one person who was older whose husband worked at Cantor Fitzgerald and lost 30 friends. But lots of students had people, had relatives, they had friends, so that was very emotionally powerful. Again, I wouldn't say, I really remember being here and doing these talks, and people are lined up on the thing. I wouldn't say that I really remember people being particularly angry. I feel like people were sad and worried and, much more focused on the sort of hardships that was being experienced. And the other thing that's sort of interesting is that over all these years, because I often have insisted on teaching something about the war on terror, even if nobody wants to really hear about it, but over these years, especially in the early years, a lot of people, first of all, we had some veterans on campus, right, who were coming back. And so, I had veterans in my class, and some of whom wanted to talk, some of whom didn't. Also, a lot of students had family and friends in Iraq and Afghanistan. And what I would say about that, maybe this is because I'm being selective in my hearing, I felt like a lot of students who had people over there were saying that their family member or friends were really emotionally a mess when they came back, or even while they were there. I always remember one student in my class whose brother was still in Iraq, And she was saying how every Sunday night the family would talk to him, and her father found it so upsetting to listen to his son. He didn't want to go on the telephone. So I sort of remember, have an overlay that the people with military experience, that wasn't like gung-ho, this is great, I believe in this. Just like people were really messed up. And I felt like the veterans that I knew who came back to campus, you know, once they began talking about their experience, I really felt like it was very negative. So it sounds like none of that was happening, or was some of that happening?
I will say, I grew up in California, and so we had that very distant disconnect, because it was very unlikely that you were going to run into someone who knew someone who was a victim of the attack or had a relative there, because, I mean, thousands of miles away, it's very unlikely. And so I think that emotional disconnect from it as well, it was an emotional thing because it impacts our country as a whole, but you didn't have someone actually there that like makes it real, if that makes sense. And I think that kind of also played a little bit into the impact of it. And while I don't know anyone who was ever stationed in Afghanistan or Iraq, or maybe I do, and I just don't know about that, I do know someone who is currently active duty in the United States Air Force, stationed over in Washington State. And he is a mechanic for C-17s, which are cargo planes. And so, maybe I'm jumping the gun a little here. When we withdrew from Afghanistan, he had a few C-17 planes come into his base that he
Could you
had
say
to
that
go
again,
in.
because mask?
Oh, when we withdrew from Afghanistan, he works at a base in Washington State on planes C-17s, which are cargo ships. He had a few of those come in, and he told me he had to go into work, and he could feel the pain just standing in there. It was empty, but he could smell the blood and the vomit. And while he was never, hopefully will never be in the Middle East, he still had that pain, and it's coming back. And I think there's a new wave of service members starting to see that as well, rather than actually having to just be there.
They're starting to see, could you just amplify that a little?
They're starting to see the pain and suffering of that without having to be actively in the Middle East. And it's starting to spread, I think, word of mouth more, especially with our generation, since it's less likely for some of us to have connections.
So I wonder if we can pick up on that, because I think it's a fascinating point, but sort of move back, because that sounds like a recent phenomenon.
Yeah, that was like probably, I don't know, a month ago.
Okay, so you know, and critically important, maybe that's changing, or changing some dynamics. I'm wondering, you know, getting to this question of your impressions of Afghanistan and the American role in Afghanistan before this summer, right? And going back and thinking about sort of what role that played for you all, if at all, and then has it changed since the events of this summer? And it sounds like maybe, you know, Nicole answered that a little bit already, but we can expand upon that, I wonder. And by the way, I should say, if anybody wants to participate from
definitely.
the audience, just shout, right? It doesn't have to be just us talking on the stage, so. I mean, yeah, Isabel.
Could you go,
Yeah, what I think is interesting talking to people in our generation who were like born right before it, is how many people were shown the videos of the towers falling in school. Because I definitely saw those in elementary school. And I don't remember when the first time I found out about it was, but I always thought that was crazy that they showed that to kids. And something else is like, I didn't even know there was a war until like middle school, but I knew about 9/11 like when I was like 6, probably, maybe even earlier. So like it's interesting the things that we were aware of and the things that we very much weren't.
Yeah. So did you, when they showed you the videos of the towers falling, did you know what it was?
Yeah, I mean they told us.
Okay.
What it was. They said that like I knew, like they taught us like what the different planes did, kind of stuff.
Okay.
Like I knew that one was taken down in Pennsylvania and all those kinds of things. I don't know exactly what age I knew this, but I remember in elementary school watching the videos and like I knew what was happening because
Yeah.
we talked about it.
Okay. But not aware of the war.
of the war, right? That's
Right.
really interesting.
Yeah, I always thought that was interesting because, yeah, when I was in middle school and I found out about this, I was like, what do you mean we've been in a war my entire life? I was
So
Thanks, Isabel.
interesting. I'm actually wondering how many people are here basically didn't really think about the war. They all heard about 9/11 at some point. You know, maybe, second grade, fifth grade, right? But it didn't really hear about the war. Like, it wasn't really, something that was a big deal, right? Until it just ended. It's really, yeah, go ahead.
And I thought I saw another student.
Yeah.
I want to say something too.
I just wanted to comment that there's a reason that a lot of our students and young people didn't know about the war. It's because the military had learned from Vietnam. When we saw pictures of coffins coming back to the States, we didn't see that in Afghanistan or in Iraq. It was hidden, and there was a conscious effort on the part of the media, mostly because the administrations made a purposeful effort to hide the war and not show the real costs that were occurring. Only when some of the troops began to come back and tell of their stories did many Americans begin to learn about the terrible sufferings that occurred. So,
Yeah, no, I thank you for that point. I think it's really important. And there's some other dynamics that are fascinating with this that I don't want to divert the conversation. I want to get to the student. But there's one is all volunteer force is part of this too, right? So it's not everybody thinking that they could be the one dying in Afghanistan or Iraq. It's people who volunteered to fight. And the military likes that it's all volunteer force because the draft didn't work that well. It caused all those other problems. There's also this fascinating research in that, and this gets to the brutality of war that we don't see anymore, and maybe one reason we don't see as many body bags. Battlefield medicine has gotten so much better that the death rate for soldiers on the ground fighting is so much lower than it used to be, that we're seeing potentially an artificially low number of casualties in today's modern wars, where in the past it would have been thousands and thousands and thousands of soldiers dead, and now we're only getting dozens. But those thousands are still getting hurt, and sometimes grievously, right? So there's a whole lot to unpack in the sense of why we're not seeing the same thing, which thank you for pointing that out, Marty, because it raises some interesting, really fascinating points for how we deal with this as a society, I think. I don't know your name, but you said you were, okay, great.
So I'm one of Professor Eisenberg's students, and I'm taking her Revisiting Vietnam class, which is, we like to kind of throw back and forth what's going on with the conflict in Afghanistan, and then the takeaways from Vietnam, and especially we're on McNamara's memoir right now, which is hotly debated in class right now. And drawing back to learning from Vietnam and censorship, I wanted to pose a question with regards to what information was gathered and given to the presidents that were dealing with the Afghanistan conflict that was perpetrating staying in Afghanistan as a good idea and a successful idea. Because in Vietnam we saw JCS and Congress war hawks essentially pressuring Johnson, according to McNamara, in regards to increasing troop deployment and trying to effectively establish democracy in South Vietnam. So what extenuating factors were perpetrating some successful outcome?
I mean, you're talking about what intelligence was coming up, Phil?
Right. Well, I wouldn't even say it's like, to pose an example, General Westmoreland, in response to McNamara coming to Vietnam on one of his many trips, like to say that the situation is not in a stalemate, but instead it's a slow, it's progressively getting better. Like if we continue putting more troops into Vietnam, there will be a successful outcome. So I'm wondering if there's any type of comparison that can be found with the war in Afghanistan that was being perpetrated by military advisors.
Do you want to respond to that?
I'll quickly. I mean, I think in a lot of cases you could replace Vietnam with Afghanistan and you'd have the same story. Because the story from the military was always that we just need more resources, we'll be able to make progress. But another part of it is the military sort of rolling over, especially young presidents. So Barack Obama was not really too keen on the surge in Afghanistan. But the military essentially said you have to do this or all is lost and it's going to utter defeat and you can't be the president that loses Afghanistan.
You know, I would differentiate just a little bit in terms of, you know, what happens over time. Because I think what is true is that, so first there's the thing that this is really super successful. And it sort of looked that way because
Right.
the Taliban, you know, went away and so. But I would say by the time that you're like in 2006, 2007, there is an awareness that the Taliban is coming back and things are not going well. And at that point, what starts to be said by critics is, oh, well, the problem is that they diverted troops from Afghanistan to Iraq, right? That was stupid, that they thought that they had won and they sent the troops out and that they needed to keep more troops in. So there was like that period, and that's more like what Paul is saying, you know, oh, well, if we just get more troops and, you know, make up for it. So there was that. And then Obama was elected. And partly Obama was elected on the idea that Iraq was incredibly stupid, but that Afghanistan was, you know, was more worthwhile. So there's a very key moment of decision in 2008 when Obama comes in. And it is worth saying that within the Obama administration, Joe Biden, by contrast to Secretary Clinton and Secretary Gates, Joe Biden, who's vice president, said this is not going anywhere. This is a failure. We need to deal with the fact that it's a failure. But he was overruled, partly because, again, I think one thing that it really is important and is super relevant is and it's Vietnam, president doesn't want to look like a loser. And here is like Barack Obama, the first Afro-American president. Is he going to take troops out and have Afghanistan fall the way it just did? Is he going to take that risk? No. So more troops are sent in. And then there's a lot of PR, like right around there, because I remember, because I was always arguing with my classes about this, that people would say, oh, Petraeus would say, oh, it's going really well. So there's like that. But then I think once you get past that excitement, then what we now know is that at the middle level of military people there, they knew it wasn't going well. There was plenty of reporting. This is the Washington Post did a huge thing about, you know, from studies that were done, that wasn't going well. But the communication at the upper level was, you know, was much more positive. So, I mean, you know, people, because nobody wanted to say that it was a failure. I mean, weirdly, Trump was willing to say it was a failure because he could blame Obama for it. But you have a lot of the skewing. And a lot of people, but you know, the bottom line, maybe to summarize some of this, is that the bottom line is people did not want to tell the president that this is such a flop, that we should stop wasting money, we should stop killing people, we should stop sacrificing soldiers. It's a flop, leave. There was a great reluctance to say that. And you're seeing from the price that Joe Biden is paying right now that this has politically really damaged him. You know, right? I mean, he's taking a lot of criticism, and it's not, you know, we haven't come to the end of it.
I just have one just really quick question, and it's in regards to Afghanistan and the weapons displacement following our departure. And you said that, you know, Bush went into Afghanistan with the notion of fighting terror in its broad definition. And I'm just curious how this weapons displacement is going to further grow that terror, and how the U.S. is going to kind of take further steps to, I guess, try and fix that, because we're already seeing also in other countries affected by military ordinance that civilian casualties are still growing, and there's just scattered landmines everywhere that are manufactured on U.S. soil.
quickly, I don't know if it'll have much of an effect on Afghanistan because it was awash in so many weapons to begin with. I mean, we have to think, Afghanistan's not been at war just for the past 20 years with the US. It was at war with the Soviet Union, started with the invasion in 1979 through 1988, and then there was a civil war in the early 1990s through 1996 when the Taliban finally did this. So it's been awash in weapons for a long period of time. Certainly, it doesn't help. I will say that. The U.S. approach now, and this is probably where it's going to recede from sort of our viewpoint again, maybe even more so, and this is where I don't think Joe Biden's going to suffer politically from this, even though that's not the question here, is what we're going to see is the U.S. doing a traditional counterterrorism mission in places like Afghanistan, where every once in a while there are drone strikes or bombs being dropped on suspected al-Qaeda or Taliban or related actors, and we'll hear about the bomb and then we won't hear anything else, because what happens with that is that the U.S. military generally assumes that whoever they've killed is a terrorist actor, and they don't verify this, and sometimes they can't, but sometimes they don't want to. So that's probably, I think, what we'll see, and given the overwhelming support the American public has for things like drones and bombs and others, we'll probably just go along with that for a while, is my take. I don't know if...
No, I'm really, yeah,
Yeah, and I was wondering if that brings back to the panel in some ways. I mean, what do you all think about sort of where we are with Afghanistan? Is it meaningful to you? And of course, the audiences too. So, but I want to give you, you're all sitting up here and agreed to do it, so I want to give you all a first shot at this, and then we'll engage more widely.
I can go. So I think that, tying all those questions in and then our original question, I'm not so sure if my thoughts in particular changed due to, everything that happened over the summer, but I think it just brought up a lot of different questions, in particular, like the concept of what would happen if we did withdraw under a different administration, and I don't think that's something I ever really considered before, but I think that it's important that our generation in particular kind of grew up with the phrase the war on terror, and I'm not so sure that everyone really relates it to a specific war, like fighting in Afghanistan, because I actually think it was Demalia who said it in class the other day. You're declaring war on an abstract concept, and I think you kind of think of it that way and not so much thinking of the war on terror as fighting in Afghanistan, although that's obviously a very big part of it. So I think that our generation in all kind of has a desensitization to the concept of war in general, and maybe terrorism in general, because it is something that we kind of grew up with being normal.
It's so interesting.
That was a lot
That's
to unload.
it's really interesting.
Dave, you wanted to add anything? Oh,
Yeah.
okay.
I also want to propose something about the war on terror. I don't think that the war on terror as we know it is actually a war on terror. I think it is the U.S. inciting violence on people, on Muslim people as well as people in the Middle East, because Islamophobia has been in the Western ideology since the conquest of Al-Andalus for a very, very long time, and that has shaped the way we think about, Afghanistan as needing democracy. And second off, if we want to continue with this quote-unquote war on terror and counterterrorism, we need to start focusing on white supremacist terrorism, because most of the war on terror narrative has been on extremists from the Middle East. So.
I think that it's completely externalized, the war on terror in this sense, and it's otherizing, where you're right to point out there's a giant problem with domestic, for lack of a better term, domestic terrorism. Much of it that is based on white supremacy. So we define the war on terror in this particular way that makes some things threatening and other things not threatening. And that has a lot of, I think this goes back to what Damali was saying too, and sort of how she experienced 9/11 and sort of how this is related.
Can I just say something about
Yes,
that?
please.
So I, growing up, always thought like the war in Afghanistan was not necessary, even though I didn't have any family members to serve or whatnot. But I remember like growing up thinking like America always had this ideology of being the world power and America coming first. But it really upset me when I saw the budget spending and I saw like the majority of it went to military spending, and not a lot of it was going to education, healthcare, stuff that people really need, like the necessity you need to live. And that's just like, how can America put so much money in its defense spending rather than caring for its people here in the country who are suffering? And so like when we withdrew, you know, my family and people, close friends of mine were just like, okay, it was about time. Like we were going nowhere. We were just spending money recklessly, not caring about what was going on with education, healthcare, and all that stuff.
It looks like somebody else wanted to speak.
Oh, yes, thank you, Damali.
And then we should
Yes.
probably wrap up.
Okay, 20 after.
Good afternoon. I realize we have a very short amount of time, so I'll make it quick.
That's right.
I'm very rarely ever move from my center, but this topic does move me. So I'm just gonna leave a couple of thoughts and hope that all of you and anybody else who bothers to attend to here maybe fixes this stuff in the future. So my name is Andrew Feliciano. I have the pleasure, I have attended 2 of your classes, Dr. Eisenberg. I spent 17 years active duty military. I'm a disabled combat vet, disabled through combat. I'm happy to be back with 2 arms, 2 legs. I'm still a federal employee at the Department of Veterans Affairs Medical Center in Northport. I deal every day with 19 years old who are missing limbs or worse, that thought war was like playing Call of Duty. They misinterpreted that people shoot back. This is, I think, one of the problems in our society, that because America's been at war, I think we can agree, I don't know the exact number, but I'm gonna say at least 89% of its existence. So you volunteer to join a military that is in war, either publicized or not, more often than not, and people get hurt. And instead of taking care of old people, like you say, or veterans, because it's too expensive, we continue to aid countries who participate in terror or whatever the case may be. There's a couple of points here that I want to point out that I think really is just the overall media and American citizens just don't get, specifically American politicians. My first point is Asian culture and Asian states, it's scary to American politicians, scary. Most of them only know it from, at least when I was growing up, Channel 11 Kung Fu movies on Sundays. That's it. They don't really know that India is an Asian country. They just think of it as a buffet. These are politicians, mind you, the same people who are supposed to be making decisions for our country. They don't know these things. They don't know the culture. There's not many politicians of this background, Muslim background, Asian background. It's still the same 65 to 75 years old that are in culture. If anybody here wants to change the culture of American identity to stop this stuff, then we really need to promote participation in our youth, stop dumbing down American education, and encourage people from, I'm gonna say 22 to 45 to really get into politics and make a difference. Because if you think somebody like, I'm just gonna name a name, I doubt anybody except for you guys really know, Strom Thurmond. How long was he an elected official, right? Do you know his background? And he was still making laws, right? That's what's happening with now. So that's the first point. The second point is, again, it doesn't surprise me to hear today's youth, they're aware of the towers falling down, I saw it. But they're aware of towers falling down, but they weren't aware of a war. That baffles my mind.
It's really
I'm Latino, so I have a shit ton of nephews, nieces, brothers, and sisters. They would much rather, this is sad, and I'm not mocking anybody at all. But my niece would rather anything concerning TikTok than the country at war. Now, that's not a knock on her or today's culture.
Could you say that one more time?
My niece, she's 16, I think. She'd rather watch TikTok, 16-minute videos, and take chippy-chappy classes in her school than actually become educated, because that requires effort. That's not a knock on her, that's society today. Again, what I believe, the continued dumbing down of American students. Right? No money for education, but there's money for war. Another point is that the media, you, sir, you pointed it out with the coffins. There's two sides to that coin. One is, it disgusts me to no end to hear students on this campus that are 17 comparing the escape of Kabul to the escape in Vietnam. You have no concept, none. And you compare those things at 16, 17 years old because you saw a picture of it? I can't buy that. And that's because the education system in America continues to not provide our students with what they need to succeed. Now back to those pictures. So when I was served, there's a lot of those pictures that leadership, administration specifically says no, don't air this. Prior to us going into Afghanistan, prior to us going into Iraq, we knew months ahead of time. So the war started in Iraq in March 2003. I can tell you in December we were doing circles around Israel, ready to shoot missiles, just waiting for the word. There's so many things that happen behind the scenes that we don't, or as a whole, the United States doesn't want the citizenry to really find out, because if they knew, then there would be a bunch of 22 to 45-year-olds right now in office making a difference instead of talking about it. They'd be doing about it. Again, I'm sorry to take up all the time. I can talk about this all day with facts, not feelings. It's hard for me to separate the feelings because I've been there. I saw missiles blow people up. This is a real thing for me. I still wake up with that. I do my best to keep it moving. I think I do a good job. I'm still here. But there's so many of my brothers and sisters that didn't come back. Right? So that's very real to me. And I'll leave you with this. Right? So you really endeavor to make a difference. Freedom will, this is not from me, I heard somebody else say this. Freedom will always stay sweeter to those who actually fight for it. So I beseech and respectfully request each one of you on this panel, all of you too, Dr. Eisenberg, stand up and make a difference. It's terrible to just sit on the sidelines knowing you can make a difference, but you'd rather bitch about something than take action. Action is what's needed from 22 to 45-year-olds. That's where it's at. I thank you for your patience, and I'm sorry to be so long-winded.
Yes,
So,
thank you.
thank you.
Do you want to
No.
say anything to wrap up?
No.
So I want to thank you all for your comments, for your participation, for listening, for thinking about this. I want to especially thank Damali, Nicole, and Amanda for joining us up here, being more than willing to join us and be put on the spot a little bit. Thank you so much. You know, that's one thing that gives me hope, is that, you know, on campus we are talking about these things. We do have a lot of great students that are willing to do this. You all included too, that are over here and listening. Even if you didn't participate, that's, you know, being part of this is important. So, and thank you, Dr. Eisenberg, for putting this together.
And thank you, everyone, for
so-
being. But these issues are not going away.
No,
right?
they're not. We'll be here next year, I'm
And
sure.
actually, I want to leave with a question, actually, so just
Okay.
to make people a little crazy. But this is what's worrying me. It really is worrying me. It's not rhetorical. Is I really am watching every day where these people in Congress are like doing things like saying they don't want to let old people get help for dentists. I just, to me, right? Or that, you know, that we can't afford that when a woman has a baby to have her have paid leave for 3 months. I mean, I feel like it's so unbelievable what's happening in Washington. The entire Republican Party unwilling to pay for these things. And I guess my
Some
question...
number of Democrats too.
What?
Some number of Democrats,
Yeah,
too.
right.
Correct.
And, you know, so to me, my question, and we can't answer this in a panel, is, you know, what will it take for people to tune in and say, oh my God, we have 5,000 nuclear warheads. Shouldn't we be able to pay for dentists, right? Or vision, or for 3-year-olds to have, you know, have pre-K? You know, when is it gonna happen that the public will become really alerted to this? And that these crazy priorities are gonna be changed in some way? So that's my question. It's not an optimistic one, but it's an honest one. And thank you for everybody for coming and participating.
Thank you. Thank you all so much.
Fritz.
Oh, I hope you enjoyed it. That's great. Good, good. Well, you guys, you all were great. Fantastic.
I just completely didn't know.